Humans of Earth, how are you doing today? My name is Michael Rollins, and I am joined by my great friend Thanos. We both have worked quite a long time in software in engineering in Silicon Valley. And today we are going to help prepare you for the eventual coming of our robotic overlords. How are you, Thanos?
I'm doing well. Hopefully, we will ingratiate ourselves with the overlords and they're not going to do away with us at the end of this.
That is actually the entire point of this podcast, is to make ourselves indispensable as we prepare the human minds for the coming apocalypse. Robotalypse? What is it? That is a really, that's, that's a wild word to try to say. All right.
We should
So,
ask the robots
Thanos,
how this is pronounced.
so, ladies and gentlemen, and all of the others, welcome to our inaugural episode of Will AI Snap That? Our entire purpose with this podcast is to help you, as the audience, contend with all of the questions that both Thanos and I get on a regular basis, which is, I am in this field. Do you think AI is going to replace me? And the answer, as you can imagine, is often not yes or no. It is often very nuanced. Thanos, how often do you get that question, do you think?
A few times a week,
Okay.
usually
Is
in the
it
software field.
in the software field, right? A friend of mine who is a longshoreman recently asked me if AI is going to replace him, which was the first time I've ever really stopped to think about, oh, wow, like there's real physical implications here as well. It's not just, oh, well, people that work in the digital space are going to have to contend with this. Like there's actual real world jobs that are fully physically based that may get replaced by AI.
And when you combine the recent improvements of robotics together with AI, right, where you had the last 10 years or so, the drones and all the electronics that
But,
enable these precise movements. And before we could barely
well,
have these things that moved on a carpet. And now we have these Boston Dynamic robots that can do flips.
right. Yeah. So one of and we can kind of just sort of get into this. One of the frameworks that I often use to be able to start thinking about whether or not AI will replace a field is the likelihood of failure and the cost of failure. The idea being, well, what is the likelihood that AI is going to fail in this job? And how costly will that failure be? And the answers to those two things are wildly different from place to place. And so the likelihood that AI will fail in something like a longshoreman, like a cargo carrier kind of a thing where they're picking up multi-ton cargo containers and moving them, the likelihood of failure is probably actually lower than you might think, because everything's in a grid pattern and they've got these giant, cats that sit over top. But the cost of failure is potentially extraordinary in the sense of, well, these things don't stop fast. And if you smash one into a human, that human no longer exists. Or if you smash one of these into a boat the wrong way and you turn the boat over, that's a pretty high cost of failure. Do you have a framework that you tend to use when you're looking at these things?
I like that cost of failure, but I think you also, there's a couple things I would add in there, which is you have to then compare it to human failure. Because if we're
Right.
replacing humans in some way, then it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be better than humans. I was watching a video this morning where there was a Waymo in, I want to say Austin,
Mm.
and there was a scooter riding ahead of it, and the scooter fell right into the path of Waymo, and the Waymo just made a nice little left turn, went around the scooter. If it was a human driver, that would have probably killed them. So that was pretty impressive. And you basically have to compare it to, would a human been able to solve the situation, or would this have been, this scooter rider would have been dead if it wasn't. So once we cross that threshold, that becomes interesting. And then we can do better than that, right? And if you think of the better scenarios, that's actually quite interesting. One of a person in this thread I was looking at was commenting, hey, well, what happens if there was a car to the left and the Waymo couldn't have moved to the left? And say, well, maybe it was smart enough that if there was a car to the left and it knew it didn't have that option, it would have been more cautious with the cyclist. sorry, with the scooter guy. So then you're
Scooter.
basically now moving the curve to things that humans couldn't do. Because as you're driving around, you're not always thinking, well, what if that person falls off? Will I have space to do the maneuver? The computer can do that. And they can do that all the
Yeah.
time. So I think that kind of innovation becomes exciting as we can basically move off a trade off curve and create a new curve that is somewhere else.
Yeah. The interesting thing about the scooter example is there is an experience level at which a human probably could make similar decisions as the Waymo did. I mean, I hadn't seen it. I hadn't seen how close the scooter was to the Waymo, whether it was like super close or whether there was enough lead time that, somebody with enough experience would be able to say, oh, but I know I have children that are all either learning to or have just learned how to drive. I would not want to be the scooterer in the instance that one of my children is following them and the person falls because they don't have the experience to navigate that situation as successfully as one would hope. Not that they're
Yeah.
bad drivers, but
This
it,
evolves making, when you get experience, you kind of make certain predetermined decisions, right? When something similar happens to you, for example, in that scenario, that hasn't happened exactly like that to me, but I've thought about this thing before, right? And if it's pedestrian versus human, you would swerve to avoid the pedestrian and you'd be okay hitting anything else in your way, right? Because I'd
yeah,
rather hit a car because if I run over the pedestrian, they're pretty much a goner. If I hit a car, well, we got some chances of doing some damage, but we're
right.
probably okay, right? So a more
Mhm.
junior driver may not have that automatic thing built in their head. And obviously
Right.
the computer overlord already knows like, well, if I don't have space to the left, maybe I slow down just in case they fall.
Right. Yeah. I like that, not just the likelihood of failure, the cost of failure, and whether the failure rate is better than a human failure rate, which is I feel like that's a really good framework in which to look at a lot of this stuff.
I think that's
So
going to be also more relevant in the beginning than it will be in the end, right? Because at some point when the robotic overlords have taken over, then we don't really care how bad humans were at this. We now expect
yeah,
perfection.
yeah, and we're all batteries by that point, I think is the expected trajectory of our evolutionary development now. All right, so let's turn this over to our own field. You and I have both been software engineers for probably a lot longer than either one of us would care to pronounce on this here show. And I know that we've actually been talking quite a bit in some of the genesis of this thing where we're we're recording this at the end of December in 2024. And y'all will probably have seen or heard this by January of 2025. But I OpenAI announced, their Shipmas, which God, what a name. And I think the first or second day they introduced $200 subscription to ChatGPT that actually ended up getting you Sora, but we didn't know that at the time. And there may be more that we haven't heard about, but that gave you access to their O1 Pro model. And you were somewhat incredulous when I told you that I had immediately purchased the $200 subscription. Why don't you tell people about your experience with that
I
after I
lasted a whole
convinced
two
you?
days. I think you told me on a Friday and I think, or maybe a Thursday, and I had it purchased by Saturday.
Mhm.
Um, and it's great, by the way. It's great to be paying $200 a month to wait for about a minute and a half till every question we have is answered. So I really appreciate that part. But in all seriousness, it's actually quite impressive in many ways. Seems to be able to reason much more deeply about things, and you can do things where before you need two or three or four shots, you could do this with this thing in one shot. So I really like the answers that you get with this. I'm still like about a week or two into this, so I'm not sure I've even scratched the surface of what it can do. I tend to like to play with it and try it with everything that I do to throw it in that model and see what it comes up with. But it was really the first thing that impressed me is we're mucking around with this little puzzle. I don't know if you've heard this one, but you have three wolves and three sheep, and they're in one side of the river, and you're going to move them to the other side of the river, and you
Mhm.
can only put two in a boat, and the boat cannot come back by itself. And if there's any point in time anywhere more wolves than sheep,
Mhm.
it's a massacre. So I just fed that into it, and it reasoned it perfectly well. It gave me all the steps one at a time. It took me like at a diner with little sachets of sugar, moving them around for like good 20 minutes to go through. do I do this? Right. And this
I've
took
never
like
done
one
that
minute.
one.
The integration with coding environments is kind of so-so, right? You can tell it to look into your environment, but then it spits out the code and then you have to copy paste it over existing code. So that's kind of a little janky. I'm still kind of trying to find out what are the better solutions if you want to actually do coding with it. So I think the jury's out still on how O1 will work with the coding integrations. See what else to say about O1.
So with regards to the coding integration, one of the if you have so I run everything on a Mac. I think Thanos does as well. We're not of the dirty PC world and nor the pure-blooded Linux world as it may be. And you can download the ChatGPT app and then when you're in various modes, you can say, I'm interested in you looking at VS Code. Then you have to like put some kind of extension in VS Code to make that possible. But then you can highlight your code in VS Code, go over to the window with ChatGPT and ask it a question. Um, but I actually wanted you to share the optimization, the example of the optimization that you tried, that you text me, you're like, oh my God, this is amazing.
Yeah, that was quite fun. So I had a database query that was being generated by an ORM. So an ORM is a mechanism where you can define little objects and then that thing will create you the tables in the database and kind of vice versa, depending on how you have it laid out. But ORMs are typically not super efficient in making queries. So we had this query that grew over time and it had gotten, I don't know, a couple of pages long. It was pretty nasty looking and it was taking 2 or 3 seconds. And I was looking at this query. It had some Postgres specific features, which I wasn't super familiar with. It had some SQL clauses that I'd never seen before. So I was looking at a good like hour or two to go figure this out by myself, right? Just Google the, Postgres documentation, figure out what this thing does, figure out what that thing does. It's not rocket science, but it's, relatively time consuming, right? So I just fed that query to O1 Pro and I said, what the heck does this do? Especially like this clause and that clause and that clause. And it just explained it to me first shot
Yeah.
perfectly. So I had a pretty good idea of how that worked. And then I said, well, this seems pretty slow. Can we do better than this? And boom, it just gave me one query, boom, like within a minute or two that O1
Yeah.
Pro takes. And I didn't quite understand that query either. So I said, well, can you explain this query a little bit to me? And a minute later, I had a pretty good explanation. So, 5 minutes into it, I understand what it was doing. I understand what the new thing is working. I pop it in the database and it's learning now. Instead of like 5 or 10 seconds, whatever it was taking, it was like 65 milliseconds. So
Which
it
is
was
insane.
pretty impressive. Further to that, I wasn't sure that the query that they proposed was exactly what I needed.
Mhm.
Um, it kind of looked about right, but it wasn't like I didn't, plug it in and actually test it. I did further test it, and it was actually like mostly correct. I'd say 95 to 99% correct. But I think with a few tweaks, we can get that into production pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So that was like, dang, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's interesting. With when I use ChatGPT and I did this with Claude and I've done this with a lot of other things, is the oftentimes I'm not asking it to write a whole file. I'm not asking it to build a whole class for me. A lot of times what I'm asking it to do is something I know how to do. And it's also something that is going to take me an hour or maybe 2 hours. And I can just kind of t- pick it up, hand a part or all of the code to ChatGPT and say, I need to do this. And can you get this done? And, a minute or two later, all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, well, here you go. And then I copy paste back in and it's, I'm not having it design my code as it were. I'm not having it architect it, but it is doing all kinds of ChatGPT is doing a lot of the grunt work that would take me more time than it was worth to get it done. And so in my mind, like when so, kind of as a little bit of background, I'm a CTO of a very, very small startup where I'm the only full-time engineer. And Thanos, you do contracting in various different environments, but we're both more or less independent. And I look at that $200 a month, and I have a few folks that do work with me for like either equity or other things. And I'm like, it's actually probably worth it in terms of a speed up to have to like just pay for it out of my own pocket for these people that are working with me. And because at least at the stage that my company's at right now, It is all about velocity. Like ship it, ship it, ship it, ship it, ship it. If you're not shipping 2, 3 times a week, preferably 2, 3 times a day, then you're not moving fast enough. And so like I look at this as that's $200 a month that I can spend per engineer to make them much, much faster. And that's a no brainer as far as I'm concerned.
I completely agree with that. I think it probably paid for itself just after dealing with that query, right? I was
Yeah.
able to deal with that in an hour. It would have taken me 2 or 3 to, get the whole thing done. So that
Your,
was amazing.
yeah. Your hourly
I
rate
think,
is probably over
oh
$200
yeah,
an hour.
it's a no brainer for that.
Yeah.
The fun part though comes to how you utilize these tools, because sometimes if it's just hallucinate. So I was doing
Yes.
something this morning and it proposed like a particular data structure and it was just completely off. And so I think if someone used that result without realizing it's completely off, then they could go down the path of like using that data structure in a bunch of places and they wouldn't have realized. So when it first proposed this and it was off, I went like, that doesn't feel right. So there's a technique that you can use to sort of reverse it and say, okay, well, instead of starting from there, let me start from another angle. And then, it's the ones where if I've done things right, the train tracks should connect at the same place. And if they don't, something's messed up. And I think that takes a little bit of experience to figure out how to do things that way. So it's interesting in how newer engineers are going to use this that don't have the experience that you and I have and may not have hit these problems many times before, that if they rely on the AI, it might lead them down paths where they're actually not wasting time because the AI is just
Yeah.
giving them sort of some silly stuff. So I'm very
Yeah.
curious to see how that plays out over time.
So we were early on, I had made, as I was like building the thing I was building as the only engineer, I made some intentional trade-offs to say, I'm going to do this way right now. This is the lazy but fast way. And I know that eventually this tech debt that I've just created is going to catch up to me and I'm going to have to fix it. But in this instance, it was actually worth it because performance and speed wasn't necessarily like performance and speed of the code wasn't necessarily what I was indexing for, right? I wanted this in front of people so that they could look at it and say, oh my gosh, this thing exists. That's incredible. And so then eventually got to the point where we had this one query that was taking like 10 seconds. It was bad. It was real bad. And I knew exactly where the inefficiencies were, and the tech debt that I had built in meant that I couldn't just fix the query. I also had to fix the front end and I had to fix the API layer and, you know, it, but I knew that was going to happen eventually. And so this was prior to '01. I sat down and I had 4.0 and I was like, see what 4.0 can do with this. So I had 4.0. I tossed in all this code and I said, fix this. It could not. It couldn't even figure out what the heck was happening. And I'm tempted to go back and find those branches and hand it to '01 Preview or '01 Pro and see what it would do. But there is an interesting point there, which is the larger the expanse of the thing you're trying to fix, it seems like it does much worse. And so asking it to optimize a single query where, hey, this all works versus optimizing a query that is then attached to an API, which is then attached to some data structures on the front end. I don't know that it can fix that. Have
Yeah,
you?
I think what you see is that the barrier of hitting a certain limit with the abstractions things can handle keeps moving, right? So before the various GPTs, we would have auto completion. And what it would do is it would look up like whatever you just typed and see, oh, that's an object. It has these attributes. Now you can pick from these things, right? So that's as good as it could go. Whereas now, even if you don't have that, it can kind of look at surrounding code and be like, okay, well, this was kind of like that. So if you say wrote a unit test and you want to write another one, oh, this is different. So let me just make that the same. So now we're like a little bit higher level of abstraction as to what we can handle. I don't think we're there yet, but that may be the next frontier of being able to look at what you're saying across files and sort of start digging in
Mhm.
deeper meaning into what you're doing. I think it probably already can do this in certain areas where it's pretty straightforward. So if, for example, you're doing sort of create, update, or retrieve, delete forms, right?
Right.
That's a pretty well understood kind of domain, and the training materials that these GPTs have looked at is probably large enough that it could probably, figure out what happens across a few files. Like you may have a form, the server code, the client code, but that's so standard that
Mhm.
if you said autocomplete this, it probably do just fine. But
Yeah.
if you have something that's more custom, right, you're building something new that hasn't been built before, or that the examples are kind of a bit more scattered, or the nuances of
Mhm.
what you're trying to build here are different, then that it might have some more difficulties. And that's actually quite interesting as well, because we tend to build things that haven't been built before. If something has been built 10 times over, I'm just going to go use that library, kind of just start it from scratch.
Yeah.
So for the things
Fair.
that I tend to do, these are one-offs. These are new things. Otherwise, I'll go leverage something else. So that's where the AI may struggle a bit more, as it doesn't know exactly what it's doing. So then over the years, hopefully this level of abstraction changes, and maybe I can give it like a short description of what I'm doing. And I mean, like, you can do this now, but maybe as it progresses, you can do that now. It's more successful in actually creating it. But it's pretty good if you go step by step. So
Yeah.
I've written like a whole couple of apps. I wrote an Electron app. I have no idea how Electron works. I didn't want to know how Electron works. I just needed a simple app.
Let's do the
So just
app.
Electron app template. Boom.
Uh,
Okay, now make a page that does this. Okay, now read the files from over here. Show them in a list over there. Now highlight that thing. Now if I move up and down, I want you to highlight it. Well, don't go off the end. And just bit by bit, without knowing anything, in a couple of hours, I could do something that would take me a couple of days.
so it's funny you say that. I have been forced to get better at React. For the majority of my career, I have avoided front end web development. I've done mobile, I've done back end, I've done infrastructure, I've done site reliability. Only in the very beginning of my career did I do anything with web. And this was back in like the Java Bean days when JavaScript libraries weren't even a thing. I mean, it was in the days of UE, if you remember that, but I'm dating myself. So I started this thing and I was like, all right, I gotta figure out how React works. And what's really interesting is like the learning curve was probably not as steep as it would have been for some other folks because like I've done enough with Swift UI. I understand how reactive UIs work and I really like them, but it was still pretty steep. And what was really interesting is that occasionally I would throw something into ChatGPT and I would be like, hey, this isn't working right. Like, I'm getting this error. Can you do this? And in the process of doing that, it would teach me. And that is like so much more valuable than just fix my code because all of a sudden it would start filling in these little gaps in my knowledge that I didn't even know were there. And so I started learning a whole lot more about how, React handles state. I started learning a whole lot more about, the differences between, using a context versus using a state in React and why you would want to choose one over another. And what's interesting is as I've used ChatGPT and Claude during the same time period, I have become a better engineer as a result of it because the explanations that this thing spits out, either explicitly or implicitly, fills in gaps in my knowledge that I didn't even know were there. Would you ever assume, like, let's say, all right, here you are, you're VP of engineering, you're CTO, and somebody comes to you and they say, hey, this entire team is basically just pulling as much code as they can from ChatGPT. What would be your response?
I used to play this like F-16 fighting game when I was a kid. It was like a simulator, and it had like,
Uh,
I had the manual of it. And one of the things that has really stuck with me, it has some random quotes from people. And one of them was some purported, aviator that said, "No one use all the capabilities of your aircraft, because if you don't, sooner or later, some guy who does will kick your ass." Right. So I think learning new things falls in that category, right? If you
it's
don't
true.
use ChatGPT or use any of these new things in your thing, some other company's going to eat your lunch at some point, because they will figure out how to use it. So I think you have to. On the other hand, it absolutely terrifies me, because these things are trained on the internet, and I have been on the internet. And you have very good things, but you have very bad things on the internet. And, especially like, my day job is engineering efficiency and processes. And there's a lot of really good advice of how to structure your engineering teams to be well and high performing. But there's also like a lot of really bad
Bad crap.
advice, right? And if you
Like
extend this to
like
coding,
glue. to secure the cheese to the pizza? That kind of advice?
Yeah, like, what was it, the other one?
Wait, so
Adding
you're
rocks to
telling
your
me
cereal or something like that?
if you train all these models on Reddit, that's bad?
Well, not necessarily bad, but maybe a mixed bag
Might
of
get a little out of
results.
pocket.
Yeah.
Just on a side
When we
note,
start getting like white supremacist software, there was like, no, whoa, whoa, whoa,
yeah,
whoa.
that's bad. That's bad.
Yeah.
You know, the
So that's kind of a little bit of my interpretation is that it is really useful if you know what to look for. And, again, you and I have been around. So when the chat spits something out that's like raises your eyebrow, you're like, wait a second, and you go and look into it. And, to be honest, it has messed me up a couple of times. A couple of times it let something sneak in, and then I looked at it later. It's like, oops, I should have caught that one,
yep.
but didn't. So I worry because how are we going to get the next generation of engineers to learn this stuff, right? If now it's easier for me to use ChatGPT to code something than, maybe delegating some chunks of it, you know, like form code or something like that, right? Something that someone would cut their teeth in and learn from. I'm curious as to if they're doing what you did and they're developing something with ChatGPT, they're going to get some good advice, some bad advice, and I hope that over the years, we can give them more and more good advice if that's what they're using to learn. Otherwise, it's going to be crap in, crap out
Yeah.
in that sort of situation.
One of the primary reasons, well, let me back this up. First off, I have seen firsthand that too much reliance on these tools, at least at this moment, can and will introduce systemic issues that you may not be aware of until later on down the line, unless you know to look for them in advance. And so like I said, I'm not a great React engineer, but possible. But you know what? I can throw a picture into Claude or into, I think, ChatGPT now. I can say, build this UI. And that's really great until it's not, because ChatGPT doesn't have or Claude doesn't have the context of the entire front end when it does that. And so all of a sudden you start popping out with different styles, with different things that you wouldn't even think about until you see it. And you're like, oh, that's wrong. Like over here, we've been doing it this way, and this thing just spat it out this way. And I've been around long enough to know that if I pull this file up after somebody's been working in the code base over here, they're going to look at it and go, what the hell? Like, why would you write it that way? And similarly, when because of the locality, if you will, of the actual, like its ability to see anything, oftentimes it will make local optimizations on the page that you don't want it to make, like pulling state in where it doesn't need to pull state in, because it just doesn't have that overarching context. And so I do think there's almost an instinct that you develop over time to know that this is bad. And I agree with you. It's like, well, even if I rely on this too much, am I going to lose that instinct and not realize that I'm pulling like a ticking time bomb into my code base? And that is something I periodically worry about. I use this too much, which is why I tend to constrain it to very small things still. But
Yeah. And if you think about how this evolves in different areas, there may be places where we can use better prompting to fix some of the issues. So take the front end examples, right? You could say, hey, in my front end, if I'm developing a page, here's my structure, right? My components live over here.
right.
Page has a front and a back, and it works like this. And okay, so now you've drawn a pretty good border. You can then say it should look roughly like how all these other pages look like. So it uses the same patterns. Okay, now we're this far. You mentioned state, right? So now you're talking about patterns as to how a page works with other parts of the app. So can we start standardizing what these rules look like? And those are good not only if the AI is doing it, it's actually often good when people are doing it, because if each page needs to know about every other page, you get this mess. So we typically will come up as we try a new app, we'll learn how this structure works for this app, figure out what the good practices, the best practices are for this sort of thing, and start putting in some constraints that help humans or AI to build this in a certain way. And that's architecture, right? So again, that's moving up the level of abstraction. I'm not just building a page, but now I'm thinking about architecture. How does this page interact with other pages? which state lives in which hierarchy parts, which is global state, and how do I maintain that? How do I ensure global state doesn't get too big and doesn't mess things up? So it forces you again at a different level. I don't think we're there yet where the AI can solve this for you, right? You would maybe it can if you're able to describe it, but I think you to describe it as a prompt, you need to have a pretty good understanding of it. Um, and I haven't played that much with it. This may be a shortcoming for us, right? Maybe this is something that you and I, because we're good at it, we can go and see how the AI does with it.
Yeah.
And maybe other folks that are not as good with it are getting AI help. And I'm not sure what the output from that is. Is it good? Is it bad?
Yeah.
But we'll be finding out.
That is a very, very intriguing question. Is our, we don't have to answer this now, but is our experience a hindrance at some point? All right. So
Well,
here,
let's answer that. Right?
yeah, go
It is
ahead.
a hindrance if you just get stuck in your old ways.
Yeah.
If you're like, I know how to do this, and I know how to do this very one way, you're kind of stuck in that.
Hmm.
So I use JetBrains Suite in my development, but I
Hmm.
haven't yet found a really good plugin that will integrate well with it. Lots of
Hmm.
folks are using what's the new one that is a built-in IDE based off of VS Code that does everything Cursor. So a lot of folks are using Cursor, but I can't stand VS Code. So I was like pushing it, and like I don't want to deal with this, right? But at
Look,
some
man,
point, it's like, hey, I'm actually missing out on a lot of good stuff. So the next couple of days, I'm forcing myself to start using Cursor a little bit, and it's excruciating, right? Because I know how to like click on one thing and go to another thing, and now nothing works. All my plugins are
yeah,
messed up. But I think these are the sort of things where if you're just stuck in how you do it, and yeah, I'm experienced with this, and I'm not changing because I'm really good at it, you're not going to see progress.
after years of working exclusively in Xcode, I can tell you that yeah, there
Yeah.
is more.
I went back to it for a client last week. And I was like, what are these 12 little
Jesus.
icons up there on the top? Like,
Yeah,
I got to remember what
no.
these do.
Like, yeah, oh, awful. Sometimes it's so bad. Okay, but that is a different podcast. All right, so here's the time during the podcast where Thanos, we're going to rate the snappability of software engineering based on a reasonable guess of like the current state of AI versus where it might be in just a little bit. And so I think the way that we're going to do this, and I reserve the right to change this at any moment, is that on a scale of 1 to 4, let's figure out the snappability of software engineering. So 1 being it will not impact it whatsoever. 2, there will be some impacts, but not enough to start replacing jobs. 3, okay, there's impacts now. The impacts are at a place where, okay, we're going to begin to see a reduction in the necessary group of people that do this, a reduction in force, if you will, the dreaded riff, where, okay, now this thing is potentially going to cost other people jobs because it's good enough. And 4, which is you're doomed. Your industry's over. AI is going to replace you. You are now snapped. So on that scale of 1 to 4, which is probably way too complex, but I don't want to give anybody the ability to pick 3 in the midst of 1 to 5. Where do you think software engineering is, let's say, for the next year?
I was going to pick the middle. So I was annoyed you went with the scale
I
with
know, well,
four
that's the
parts.
point. You can't pick the middle. You got to go one way or the other.
I think it was something like a 3. I don't think we're there yet where you'll have a reduction in force because of the AI. I think you'll get you're in the part where people are becoming to be a bit more productive with it and figuring out how to use it. So you may get a little bit of velocity increases. And I think you're going to get a fair amount of reorganization of how we do things over the next year. This is, again, I think the pattern that I see is that you'll get your proverbial, and this is a term I hate, but your 10x engineers, those really high performers that you have, or even higher performing because they know how to leverage these tools really well. So I think you're going to see some change out of that. I won't claim I can predict what happens after that. I think what happens sort of mid seniority and below is going to be more interesting and hard to predict.
Yeah.
And I think the fallout is going to probably come after the dust on that settles. I think there's going to be some people that work along the model that you said that they're learning with it, and some are going to probably thrive, and some are probably going to fail. And we're going to figure out how to support these folks because we do want the next batch of software engineers to raise out the ranks and be really
Yep.
good with these toolings. I hope I'm being pessimistic here in a way, and that that I hope that becomes really successful and they do figure it out. Um, it's unclear to me that as an industry, we're at the point where we'll see reductions in numbers. I think there's super duper high demand still for software engineers.
Yeah.
So if you figure out how to make them productive, there's a lot of these sort of digital transformations where companies are moving more and more stuff in the digital realm. So I think software
Mhm.
engineers, biases aside, are probably going to be well employed for the time to come. Again, nothing is static, right? So things will always change, and it's going to be those folks that are not stuck with their tools, but are willing to go and look and explore other tools. So I'd say I'm somewhere in the three. I think I can see many changes happening here, not necessarily a reduction of people, but like I think the industry is going to change.
Mhm.
And if we're just focusing on that change, it might be even closer to a four. Like this may be changing a lot. I don't think software engineers go away, but how we do things is going to be radically different over the next 5, 10 years.
So my take is it's a two. And and I think I'll redefine this on the fly because you actually bring up something good, which is if a one is zero impact on the industry, two may very well be an impact on the industry that leads to a little bit more of a plateau in terms of number of jobs available. Three being, okay, now the jobs may start to diminish, and four is the industry goes away. I would say we're at a pretty solid two, where I see it highly likely that the industry continues to grow. I don't think like the current steady state of software engineering is we need more engineers. I don't think we're getting to a place where it's like, okay, we have enough engineers. But you bring up something that is really interesting, and you betrayed your bias when you said it. You said, well, not that I believe in the 10x engineer, but the 10x engineer is going to learn how to leverage this in a way that makes them faster. And I think you actually said something very profound there, Thanos, which is the people that learn how to use these tools the best are the ones that win. I think if you have, one of the things I'm always thinking about is like, man, what does this do to new grads? Like science degree right now. Should you be worried? Like, I think at this moment, the answer is no. But what is that? What about 2 years from now, 4 years from now? And I think actually you just said the thing, which is at least for software engineering, the people that learn how to use the tools the best are the ones that are going to continue to thrive. And that actually may put pressure on the top group of people, folks like you and me who have been doing this for a long time that refuse to learn how to use the tools out of some misguided purity. And so it almost makes me wonder if the new cadre of, young computer scientists coming up will overtake the experienced people faster because it's like the people that knew how to type were able to become faster on computers than the people who never learned how to type, right? Or my mom and dad never grew up with computers, right? I kind of want some of my first memories are of computers, right? So you and I, at least I did, and probably you as well. I think we're similar age. Like we just grew up with the tool. It never became anything the tool was just obvious to us. And so I wonder if that might be what ends up happening is whoever adopts the tool faster ends up doing it better, basically.
So one thing to do is perhaps pull apart the experienced engineers and the engineers with the ability or value of learning. And there may be some correlation if you made it this far, maybe you have both. Although I can, think of examples in my career of the person that
Or
made
that
it
was
this
very
far that is
obviously
like
not true.
very set in their ways. So I think it's the learners that will progress, right? I think experience can often be a proxy to that, but it's not a guarantee to that. And we'd be veering in a sort of slightly different topic, right? Because I think learning is part of what we do is a key component. This is very much so. It's probably one of the most important things that you look at an engineer is, do you have the capacity to learn new things, right? You want engineers that look at technology, look at their environment, look at the product they're trying to build, figure out how to mesh these two. And there's a lot of learning in doing that. I think those are the successful
Yes.
engineers. I think The less successful engineers are those that have learned one thing, and then they have the hammer, everything's a nail, and they're trying to apply that one technology, right? If you say like, I'm a JavaScript engineer, or I'm a Python engineer, it means I have this one tool and I will just wield it. So I don't think that's a successful model there. Um, but maybe going scale for a second, I think we may, for future episodes, want to break this down a little bit. Maybe what we do is we think about how does it affect productivity? How does it affect employment? How does it affect the ways that we become more effective and the industry thrives, even though there's a reduction in force? Maybe because we become so much more productive, the industry grows. Maybe because AI just completely replaces it, the industry just goes away because it wasn't necessary to begin with in some other way, right? So it may be more interesting to look at it in nuanced ways because as we talk about software engineers, for me, in some ways, I'm a for because this is going to change a lot of how we do it. But do I feel that it's threatening jobs at this point? Maybe more a one or a two
Yeah.
in that kind of way. So that could be fun to sort of try segmenting things and analyzing across multiple dimensions as we do this.
Mhm. I like it. All right. So final thing for anybody that is, thinking about the folks that have not utilized these tools yet and may be more interested in beginning to utilize them. The folks that maybe have said this whole time, hey, if it was good enough for grandma and grandpa, I'm not going to use this LLM. What would be the starting point? Where would you tell a software engineer that they've listened to us and our wisdom and our incredible knowledge and understanding and good looks and said, I'm going to go ahead and take their advice. Where would you point them? How would you say this is how you get to the point of using AI in your current job?
I think the easiest thing is if your job allows it. And I know some places that don't, which is kind of
Yeah.
scary in its own way. But if your job allows it, then start using it in your job. Start, as you're coding something and you're stuck, instead of reaching for Google, just go to the chat in your IDE and say, hey, how would you do this? Or try some experiments of, the next change you want to make, what happens if you ask the IDE to do it rather than doing it yourself. And then get to asking some more complicated questions. Like let's bubble it up to the architecture and see how far we can get with that. How do we express these things in that way? If your job doesn't allow for it, that is a bummer. And maybe think about a different job because it could be a proxy for
Yeah.
short-sighted thinking. Obviously, there's exceptions to this. There's some places that you might work at that may actually make a lot of sense. Uh, eh, some places with restrictive IP or where you can't feed certain things
Right.
into the algorithm. So not doing those, but if you doing run of the mill software development with none of
Mhm.
that stuff, then I'd be curious or questioning a little bit as to why we have such a policy.
Right.
If you don't, find a side project. I had some personal stuff that I do, like filing my PDF documents away, and that was the Electron app that I was mentioning earlier. It's like, hey, I'll spend a couple of hours and just build something in technology I don't know. Go learn a new language. I hear great things about Clojure on the front end for running on the browser. So go plug that in and see how that works,
Yeah.
or try learning something new with it. I've tried a few times. I haven't tried it with O1 Pro yet. Is kind of like slightly tangential to coding, but I fully want to understand the general and specific theories of relativity. Uh, and I could go
There
read
you
a
go.
book, or I
Yeah.
could work through the AI and kind of learn something. So again, apply this to coding, but you can go have some fun with it. There's tons of tools. You don't need to splurge on the $200 to get
Yeah. No, no,
the O1 Pro, but you can go
no.
get the Claude on that
Claude's
side or the
got,
OpenAI tools. This is pretty good stuff you can get started
yeah.
with and play with and get some good plugins for your IDEs where you have them and go from
Mhm. Yeah, I think from a practical application, I mean, the choice of LLMs is there's actually quite a few. And what ends up so far, what's been happening is these LLM companies, they leapfrog each other every like few weeks to month and a half. And so you got O1 Pro right now, which seems to be kind of ascendant, but Gemini from Google's got some really interesting things on the horizon. Claude Claude interesting. They're productizing this in a better way, I think. So there's some things that I've seen with Claude that are very intriguing, especially for my company. But in order, like, here's like, obviously, if you can just use this in your job, go for it, and you just need to remember that everything you put into these models, everything you put into these products is going to be used to train these products. So if there's something that shouldn't be in the training material for these products, don't put them in. But also, I tend to enjoy setting myself little challenges. And those challenges may be as simple as here's a very simple app. How fast can I build it with this tool? How fast can I go from zero to MVP? And if I leverage this product, is I'm doing that. What does that look like? So it can
Yeah,
be
it's
pretty
also
interesting.
Advent of Code season. So again, the spirit of Advent of Code, which is a 25 puzzles over the month of December, is not to be using that to compete. But if you're not competing with others and want to just practice just solving some problems, it has some fun things
Remember,
to go solve
kids,
with and see how it works.
not unlike what one of my children's economics, personal finance professors or teachers told them, it's okay to cheat on your taxes as long as you don't get caught. So don't cheat on admin of code. And if you do, don't get caught.
It kind of ruins the whole thing, I think,
It
doing
does.
it for the
Uh,
satisfaction of solving these coding problems.
no, that was very true. So, all right. And so what you all just heard was the complete and total episode. The future episodes, and this won't take effect for a little bit, but eventually what we're going to do is we're going to get to the point where the we're going to give our rating, and then we're going to give our reason for the rating. And the reason for the rating, you will have to be a subscriber, whether that's on Patreon or Mighty Networks or something. We're going to, the intent is to build a community. The intent is to allow people to kind of engage with us directly if they're able to. And so as part of that, and a little sweetener to the pot, we're going to also provide for them like the not just the rating, but why we think the rating is and what people may be able to do going forward. So for the first 2 episodes, everybody gets that. We hope you really enjoy it. And eventually we will put that behind the subscription. So just kind of get everybody ready. Thanos, this has been lovely. I'm glad that we could cut our teeth on this particular topic because I think we're both very passionate about it. And listen, humans of Earth, we are here to help guide you through your eventual, what's the word I'm looking for here? I totally dropped the word, Thanos. Ah, humans of Earth, we are here to guide you through your eventual assimilation by the robotic overlords. And with that, peace out. May the force be with you.
Thanks, Michael. And maybe we should work this way in, but hey, thanks, Michael. And also robotic overlords, take good care of us, please.
That's right. Oh, that's right. Because the subscribers will also be part of the bootlicker community where, where once we've gained favor, we will then curry favor for them. Remember,
Right. We will help you get saved.
that's right. Oh God, do you have time to talk about our robotic overlords? And with that, goodbye, everybody.
See ya.